Your stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Story Maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, and to connect. But what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you, and you'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those situations. When I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, not necessarily to respond. But during this podcast, I'm actually asking you to listen to consider your related stories and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Today's podcast features two inspiring humans, Matt and Jason from Beard and Bowler. Be sure to visit elkinsconsulting.com to learn how I can help you and your team uncover relevant personal stories to improve sales and communication, as well as leadership. We're here today on Your Stories Don't Define You podcast with my friends from Beard and Bowler. It's a video production company, and I'm going to let them talk more about it. And we have Jason in the bowler hat and Matt in, what does that say, Mercy?
Mercy, yeah.
Yeah, should I know what that means? Am I too old?
What Mercy? No.
Long story.
It's a long story.
Okay, so it's not like a meme that I should be familiar with.
No.
Good, because I find myself falling behind a little bit here and there. So I asked you to join me on my podcast today, and I'm really excited to visit with you because when we had our phone call a couple weeks ago just to make our introductions, I was so excited to hear about some of the projects you're working on. And one of the things that I wanted to reach out and ask you about were some of the stories that have resonated with you through the work that you're doing that has maybe informed the current work you're doing, and maybe even some background stories of your childhood or young adulthood that encouraged you to get into storytelling via video. And one of the things that I loved during our first conversation was the fact that Jason knew that he needed a co-founder that could tell stories, that was a writer, and that understood all of the ins and outs about creating an engaging story. So first, Jason, can you tell me just a little bit about what your company does?
Beard and Bowler is a video production company, but we handle everything from strategy to distribution to creative and concept as well. A lot of times people will come to us and say, we need an about video. And we'll say, all right, well, what are your end goals? What are the results you want to accomplish? So we help with the strategy and the creative as well. Once they have their video, it's like, okay, we spent all this money. What do we do with it? There are multiple uses for it, but it's certainly not going to be good across the board on all social platforms and your websites. There's different versions for different platforms. So we help a lot with the strategy and distribution as well.
That makes a lot of sense. I have kind of an all-in-one so that you don't have to do the production and then hand it off to another contractor to do the rest of the distribution.
We are marketing agency's best frids.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that. I like that. Right? You should put that on your business card. So the thing that we talked about was the fact that you started in news, right? You started in news and journalism. And what I found just totally endearing was that you hit a point, Jason, where you realized all you're showing is sad news, angry stuff, bitter people, tragedy. And you know, because you are kind of an optimist in some ways, that there's a lot of good out there that no one is seeing. So tell me about this idea, this transference of your thought processes from being a journalist and in the news to doing what you're doing now.
Take it back to 2007 is when I started professional video production during the recession, just in time for a recession with a luxury item. So that was a lot of fun. I fast forward a couple years later, about 5 years down the road, I needed something a bit more stable than corporate video production. So I found a job with the news. Hard news photojournalist is what they'd call it. You'd hold the camera, you'd hold the microphone, and you'd interview them all at the same time, and then edit it in your car somewhere in a not so nice area most of the time. But I got to a point where every day was bad news. And as I'm standing there interviewing this mother who's crying that lost their son, I thought, maybe somebody will see this. Maybe somebody will watch this, learn from it, and not do it again. And I was back there the very next day, the very next week, for the same sort of terrible news.
Tragedy.
Tragedy. And I got to a point where I was like, this is doing more harm than it is good. I said, what if there was a way that we could tell positive stories and give these people, because I was in these communities that were hurting all the time from these murders, shootings, and robberies. Like, what if there's a way we could give these people somebody to look up to, as opposed to focusing on all the negative that they're doing, everything that they're getting wrong. And that's when I came to my partner, Matt, writer, philosopher, and I said, what can we do? What do you think about this? And he's like, I like this idea of hero stories. Let's run with that. That's it. That's what you want to do. That's what we can do. Let's make something of this. And then we're like, okay, wait, how do we make a living at that?
That's always the trick.
Right? But you got to find what you want to do first. And we were very lucky that we sat for a good 6-8 months and planned that this is what we want to do, down to the very specifics of not just video production, but the type of video production and the type of stories. And this is what we want to do. How do we make a living at that? And just watching the marketplace, branded content was very hot. And companies were starting to realize they can't just say, come on down, $9.99. It doesn't work anymore. You have to tell a story. You have to engage people. And you have to pull on their heartstrings and make them feel attached to your product, to you, to the story you're telling. And we're like, this is something that we could do. How do we incorporate this? So we came up with this concept of branded content with purpose. And that's basically telling a story, but telling a real story. We're not making stuff up. There's no script. There's no astronauts. There's no... There's no, we could get an astronaut. We could tell.
That would be cool. No celebrities.
Yeah.
It's really about real people that you can relate to.
Right. But there are people actually doing a difference. And if you look them up, there is ways that you can get involved and help as well through a branded content campaign. Mm-hmm. So branded content with purpose, authentic heroes, authentic stories, people to look up to, people that we've vetted and, have realized these are good people, not just like, oh, they've donated some money, they've donated some time. They have completely sacrificed their entire lives and any chance at making a good living wage to help change the world. Those are the stories we want to tell.
We actually just got back from one today.
Yes, so. It was our morning shoot, we're up at 3:30 in the morning for this, this shoot.
That is so not my favorite thing.
Yeah,
I'm not an early morning person. Let's get back to that first idea. Do you have vivid memories of the first time you did one of these?
John Paul Gonzalez was an NBA player, former NBA player, and he left the NBA because he felt at the height of his career, 20 points in a game. Coach called him in the hotel, said, do it again. Do it again tomorrow. And he sat back and he said, is this what my life's become? When do I get to help people? When do I get to reach out to people? I can't do anything from my hotel room. He was from a town in Jersey, West New York. And if you know anything about this area of Jersey, West New York, North Bergen, and Union City are the most densely populated areas in the country. And there's no community center. And the kids would have to walk down to Jersey City. They were afraid they were going to get jumped. He said, I'm going to start a community center here. These kids are getting in trouble after school because they have no place to go. I'm going to create a place that they feel safe, that they can come, that they can engage with other people and role models that they can look up to. Role models being volunteers who help out there. So he quit the NBA, playing for the Clippers, came back to his hometown and started a community center. I mean, that's somebody who's leaving money lots of money on the table.
Multi-millions of dollars, right?
Yeah, I don't even know if he would have a livable wage,
Well, right now he's a school teacher.
Yeah.
And he basically funds the gym through his public speaking. So he teaches in a public school in West New York, and then after school goes and opens this gym for these kids. And the way that he keeps the funding for the school or for the gym is he goes out and speaks because he's known.
Fees.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
he was our first hero, and I was like, I gotta tell this guy's story.
Yeah.
And he's had videos, but it's funny, he's had videos before that didn't even deter me. I was like, we gotta go in anyway. And that was like our first time working together on a hero shoot, and we're like, we can tell this story so much better, and we did. I think we killed it.
Wow. So Matt, when you had a chance to really, I know your job is kind of to craft the story itself and to help the person figure out how to share the story, which of course, as we talked about, is basically what I do as well. And I'm fascinated to hear, what about that particular story do you think might have influenced you later? Like, was there something that really stood out to you while you were there? Can you tell us a story about that?
Yeah, it should be stated that when I went on that shoot with Jason, it was to help. It was to help him realize his dream. Our wives grew up together, so we were friends. And I was just like, hey, buddy, you're miserable.
At the news, yeah.
You're miserable. I'm sick of complaining about it. Shut up and do something. And we came up with a concept together. I went on the shoot with him to help him realize it, but not with any intention of becoming his business partner, just to help him figure out how to do it. And so I don't think we even knew at the time that I was going to end up partnering with him to really do this well. And it was, so the story that I think came from that was we went out twice to this shoot, probably three times. And I didn't know my role. I'm not a video guy, writer, a storyteller, and helping other people. I sit on a lot of like boards, which is, he's helped me get out of a lot of it, because I walk into situations
and take over
and not being asked. I just kind of like, why are you doing that? That doesn't make sense. Like you could do this, just do this instead. And that's not your story. It should be this.
And then they inevitably ask him the question, will you be on our board? And I tell him before he goes into meetings, no, say no.
Say no. My husband does that to me. Yeah. He's like, you cannot take on another project.
He pins a note to me that says you're not allowed to have him. Send him back when you're done. So there was a moment I started interviewing, which is, kind of the role of a producer, and not knowing what it was, but he was stuck with a camera. So I was like, let me talk to this guy. And I think there was a moment in the filming that it dawned on him, not me yet, that this was going to be a really powerful relationship if it was something he kind of talked me into. So he tried to pay me.
He wouldn't take it.
Yeah, he tried to pay me. He's like, listen, we did this together. And I was like, hey, man, I'm just in it because it's worth telling good stories. It's what, I want to do in general. And he brought a check to my house. I still have it. It's on my dresser. Never cashed it. And it infuriated him, which brought me an unhealthy amount of glee. And it was, I think that if I was to look back there was a moment in listening to this man explain, and he had one line that really stuck with me. He said, it's not going to be policy or politics that change the world. It's going to be people. And it's going to be conversations that are had on that couch. And I realized that he's right. It's not going to be philosophy that makes the biggest ding in terms of people and their lives. It's going to be when we're willing to listen to each other and hear stories, and we're already captivated by them. But the most powerful way to do that was when I was looking into his eyes. I could have written about that, and just tore that up. And my problem is I can't bullet point things, so I'm really bad at abbreviating. But in editing, I was like, that piece, that's the most powerful piece. And I was able to look into his eyes when he said it. You can't capture that with a written word. You just can't. And so I realized kind of the magic and the power behind human connection and being able to look at someone and to feel part of their story and inspired that way. That's something only video can capture.
Well, you're combining all of those essential human senses.
Mm-hmm.
And being face to face, of course, is the very first best thing. But to be able to share what you shared with John Paul like that.
Yeah.
So
that's the moment.
Jason, at that moment,
stole my coffee.
When you, gosh.
He tends to spill things.
You guys are like an old married couple. You guys are like an old married couple.
He's my work wife.
He says it all the time. He tells everybody we have. He's my work wife. We both have beards. It's not acceptable.
So Jason, do you remember that moment as vividly as Matt does?
I remember the whole shoot being like, well, this just has to happen. And I don't think it dawned on him until later on in the editing process. And I was like, during that time, I was like, oh yeah,
he's prophetic.
This is happening.
I've learned since that I need to just listen to him when he's.
But there are, yeah.
Weeks, and it does. So it's just,
So I'm still kind of curious. I keep coming back to this moment that Matt was talking about when you must have said something to him later. There was this moment when you were talking to John Paul when I realized that we really have something here. Mm-hmm. So that's why Matt remembers that moment, because he was so in it that he didn't have the presence of mind to recognize the importance of it. So I'm curious if that moment is as ingrained in your brain, as vivid a memory as it is in Matt's.
Not at the time, because, I tend to focus on technical stuff during the shoot, but in watching the clips and then watching the way he arranged the story so that everything kind of flowed into that pivotal moment, that's when I was like, okay, all right, yep. That was the moment for me. Watching
so it was while you were doing the editing and watching the clips.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason. There's something that just popped into my head, and I have to bring this forward. Years ago, when I was planning my wedding, this is 22 years ago, I was planning my wedding, and I read this book called Bridal Bargains. And I'm an event planner, so I didn't read anything else about planning the wedding because I kind of knew how to do it and what to start with. I had my checklist. I knew what I was doing. But my mom sent me this book, and it's all about finding strategies to save money. And it's really basic stuff that people generally don't think about, like using flowers that are in season so that they're less expensive. And one of the things that they talk about is knowing which questions to ask of the people that are providing your services. Like you're going to a site, you want to look at the bathrooms that your guests are going to use. And that was like, oh, yeah, like I wouldn't have really thought about that, especially because I was looking at all these old locations in Virginia, like Middleburg, Virginia, where at one location that I really liked, the bathrooms were in an old off building that you had to walk down these stone steps to a dirt floor.
Wow.
And I had to duck. And I'm 5 foot nothing. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's no way my guests. And I was supposed to get my wedding gown on in one of those rooms. I'm like, oh no, this won't do. But the one thing, obviously a lot stuck with me about that book because it was a long time ago that I read it. But one thing that I think was in the book, I'm pretty sure, was they recommended that during the wedding weekend, starting whenever you start having guests arrive, you hire somebody, either a bridesmaid or a flower girl or one of your good friends that's not in the wedding, doesn't have a job, to come to you every 40 minutes or so, depending on how active things are around you, and to tap you on the shoulder or touch you on the hand. And the idea is that it's to remind you to stop and look around and be present. So that it slows down. When you guys know, you've both been married, that on the day of the wedding and the reception, everything just flies by. Yeah. And that's the same with any major event. Yeah. Like your thing this morning, time probably flew. At my no longer virtual conferences, those 2 days, they're just gone. And I love this idea because what it does is it stops you for a moment so that you can be present, even just for that moment. But what it did for me at my wedding is it gave me these mental images burned into my head,
Mm.
way beyond a photograph, because there was so much depth. There's so much depth to those memories, because my flower girl, who was my cousin Becca, who was 6 years old at the time, she would tap me on the hand, and I would look at her, you know, kind of startled, and she'd give me a look, and she has the best expressions, and she'd be like, which is like a mom, you know, it's kind of a mom expression. Here's a 6-year-old being very stern with me. And so because of that, I have this vivid image of this great aunt and uncle that came down from Wilmington, Delaware for our wedding. They were in their 80s then and were not around much longer after that experience. But I have this vivid memory of them dancing together at my wedding and smiling. And they had been married over 50 years.
Wow.
And if there's any kind of mental image you can get for your wedding that will encourage you to stick with that person and put your work in, because it is work to stay married that long.
Yeah.
And I have that. So I'm thinking about, I don't know, I think the reason that popped into my head was that you were so focused on what you were doing that it wasn't until you started looking at those clips that you started recognizing those moments.
What was happening? Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. That's so cool. So you're
tapping
going to tap him gently next time, right,
gently.
Matt?
You just said hit him. I was trying to help.
So
It does when you do a good job. It gives you a punch. So some of our editors crave that punch. You haven't hit me yet, so.
oh, of course. Wake up.
Yeah.
So Matt, what were you doing, Matt, before you started partnering up with Jason?
That's an interesting question and story. I'm a pastor. I write, obviously that part as well, but I think the best way I lead a church people. It's really more, I think the language scares people. So I typically don't lead with that. I don't talk about it too much. And when people really ask, what I talk about is that I come alongside people and help them in their lives, with their marriages, with their kids. I encourage them and make sure that, you know, they are asking the right questions, that they are pursuing the things that are true in them and for them. And that, you know, I think so many people were so busy either surviving, or because we're significantly blessed as a country, we have the opportunity to just be busy with entertainment and things along those lines, that I found that people haven't stopped and don't stop because they don't have to necessarily. You wake up and you can have music playing immediately and usually go to sleep with the television on. We don't have intentional silence anywhere. And one of the things that bothered me growing up is that it was almost like when I asked questions of life, it would infuriate adults. And it was just like, well, that's just because that's how we do it. I needed to know why. And I think that, like, I have 4 kids right now. That angst that's in my 3-year-old, one of my twin 3-year-old girls, everything is why. I don't know why that grows out of us. And whether it's somebody who has a faith structure or they don't, those why questions, those are life-changing. Those are direction-changing. Those help you see people. And I have this problem of hating the church. I grew up in it. And so because of my personality, I'm either shut up and do something about it, or just get out, you know, and shut up. And I came to a point in my life, circumstantially, just because of stuff that happened to me growing up, which I'm happy to talk about if you want to do that too, where it was just kind of like, I want to help people live, and I want them to think. And I don't care if they agree with me or don't agree with me. Our problem is that we're not having conversations and listening anymore. And so that opened doors for me with the Atheist Association of Manhattan. I'm currently a member, and
that's ironic.
You know, it is. Well, they asked me to have conversations about ethics, and I found that once you sit at a table with somebody and not shout things back and forth, but you just listen, that leads you towards discovering who you are, discovering what you believe, and then living more deeply towards those things, living with more intention. So I'm a pastor.
That's the answer. Short answer.
Yeah.
So, well, that leads me to a more specific question then. If you hated the church,
Yes.
what happened? There must be some specific incident or conversation you had that brought you back to your faith. Did you always have faith and you just didn't like the structure of the church, or did you kind of lose faith because you hated the church and then find it again?
Yeah. I'm going to try to give you the bulleted version.
Oh, right. I've heard about that.
Yeah. So my father was a pastor. I was always the kid that wanted to have, I wasn't just okay with, well, I believe it, so you believe it too. And so even at like 4, I was just like, no, like explain it to where it makes logical sense. And then I will jump on board. And I was a very literal child. I'm a very literal adult, sometimes to my detriment. No one would answer questions. No one could answer questions for me, and it wasn't high level stuff I was for, like, well, then how do you know that happened? And they would just be like, well, we just believe. And that really bothered me.
So what's a specific incident that just pops into your brain when you think about that?
That made me hate the church. My mom died when I was 11. It was very quick. It was brain cancer. And that, my family fell apart. My dad fell apart, got so sick, in fact, that by the time I was 13, he had to undergo some pretty substantial surgery, and the doctor screwed up, and he was paralyzed from the neck down. And so in that season, my need for answers changed, and my willingness to put up with kind of high end, not really an answer, but just kind of like, well, we just believe it, or we just do this, or we just think that that's true. My BS meter went through the roof, and I wasn't able to meet an adult that was able to give me those responses. And none of them seemed to read books. So I keep coming with books, and I was like, what do you do with Dante? What do you do with, Theophilus? What do you do with the Iliad? What do you explain this? And it would just turn them off. So I got sick of adults, and all the adults I knew were in the church. It's where I grew up. My dad was so heartbroken from losing my mom. They were truly soul mates. They just kind of completed each other, that he got depressed, and he just wasn't him anymore. And I ended up raising my sister and dropping out of school to pay the bills because he had claimed bankruptcy. And we had moved a bunch. And I was very angry, but I just wanted answers. Mm-hmm. So the thing that brought me back, simple. I was 19. I had an internship with the NYPD. And I had to take a summer job before I could get to where I was going to be able to actually work in New York, because I wanted to get as far from the country as possible. To this day, I still hate nature. I think it has something to do with it. And to me, all trees are just unfinished books. They're lazy books. And
so that's why you laughed when I invited you to Montana. Okay, I get it.
Well, yes. I will come. I'm going to stay inside. And no, I really don't hate nature that much. But I was 19. I had to get a job. I got a job at a camp, overnight camp, as a counselor, because I love kids, just always have. And no one was really around for me when I was a kid. So I will never let a kid not have somebody there know that he loves them. And it was junior high week, and the kid that was brought to my cabin, because his sister, who was 15, died 2 weeks earlier, and he hadn't spoken a word, and they didn't know what to do with him. And so they put him in my cabin. And the two of us, he didn't say much the whole week, but I got a chance to take him in a canoe, more nature. And we were sitting in the middle of this lake, and I didn't say anything, because sometimes it's not about words, it's about presence.
Mm-hmm.
But I looked at him and he looked at me, and we both just broke down and wept. I think it was the first time I ever cried over my mom and my dad, and got back on the shore, and it was different for me. I hadn't come back to faith at all in that sense, but knew that there had to be something to explain the connection, explain that, and had vigorously tried to disprove my father's convictions as much as I possibly could. So I read a lot in the negative direction. Study led me back, and started working with teens, which eventually led to poor community in New Jersey. And I would drive back every weekend from college and just hang out with kids, high schoolers that their parents were busy or non-existent. And that group of 4 in like 3 weeks turned to over 40. And I didn't know what I was doing. I wasn't preaching to them. We sat there and we talked. And that ended up with a church calling me in the city and saying, "Hey, you're going to come and work here." And I said, "No, I'm not." And then they voted on me, and I didn't candidate, and they voted on me, and I started a couple weeks later. And
we all know you have trouble saying no, right, Jason? Yeah. You know, it's
first time. You're making enemies.
No, that is a powerful moment. That I can just visualize you sitting in that canoe with that boy, and both of you weeping. I can imagine that. I was there. Of course, I do some canoeing so I could actually feel the movement. I'm just kidding, but I really felt like I was right there with you. And I think sometimes we forget that those moments are the ones that define us. And at that time, you didn't know you changed. It wasn't till later that you can look back to that definitive moment in the canoe and know that you changed. And that's what I find so powerful. And though I am not a religious person, I'm Jewish, but I'm not a religious person, I do understand where you're coming from about that human connection. And I tell people that it wasn't until I was pregnant and felt this living, growing being inside me getting the hiccups. It was literally the hiccups that alerted me to the fact that there is something greater than we are out there. And whether you want to describe that as God or universal energy or whatever you want to call it, there are too many things we can't explain to be able to dismiss all of that. So I'm guessing that that's kind of where your brain was going as you landed that canoe on the beach, to be able to say, whoa, I can't explain that. There's no science that can say this is why that happened.
Yep. Exactly. That's exactly
That's awesome. That's awesome. So Jason, now I know why Matt had to be your partner. And I'm looking at this as clearly this is why you guys need heroes, and you've chosen this path. And Matt, all of that history just makes it so obvious that you are in the right place for you. It's kind of magical when that happens, isn't it?
Yeah, it's unnerving.
Unnerving. It is. It's a little frightening because when you know you're in the right place, it feels like a huge responsibility.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for reminding me.
Well, and I just read one of those memes that said something about your life is to find your gifts and your responsibility is to give them away or to use them or something like that. And I think about that in the context of stories and how important it is to remember them and figure out which ones really are the definitive moments, because then you can share those with other people. And what I found, and I'm sure, Matt, you've had this experience, if you can share that moment of vulnerability, that very brief story, you're not just sharing that vulnerability to connect with the person, you're also sharing it to draw out the stories of the other people around you.
Yeah. I will,
giving them permission.
Let me caveat quickly for you something, because since I dropped the pastor bomb, I got to explain a direction for Beard and Bowler. We have a very specific policy, which I broke a little bit. but I didn't really, because I didn't go into details. We don't do politics or religion.
Okay.
And the reason for it is those conversations we feel are relational, and they're best had person to person when it's open dialogue and you're both there to listen, assuming that you've got something to learn and discover. And we realized, I realized a long time ago, Jason, very much of this conviction as well, that just like the news, getting on and making a point and saying it and writing it out and not being able to have that engagement, it's not helping the world.
Yeah, it does more damage, for sure.
It does more damage. It just doesn't help anybody move forward. And so as a production company, even though I'm still a pastor, our rule of thumb with these stories, with these hero stories, is unifying that element and starting the conversation. And I think if more people, religious or non, if they were willing to talk, if they were willing to listen, if they were okay not being or having to be right, just wanting to.
Yeah, that's a kicker.
We want to be conversation starters. And I think that, that extends to LinkedIn, that extends to any of our social profiles. You go on, we don't have any of that stuff on there, because look at what happened with our latest country's election. I have friends that don't speak to each other anymore because they didn't listen. They just made statements on their social media. I think that's the problem. And I actually believe that's why we're seeing suicide rates.
Agree.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's because we're dividing people, and then we're only showing them the fake moments. And so no real conversations are happening anymore, because, I think we've fostered an environment of fear where they're afraid to not disagree. They're afraid to say that I'm not okay today. And I'm hurting today. And they think that for some reason that's going to lose them that vulnerability. We have to be plastic, because if we're not, it's either going to be something that divides, because we divide over stupid things.
And that has always been around. That has always been a big issue. And what I'm seeing, though, is that it's exacerbated by the extent of it.
Yeah.
And saying that just fits right in. It's a perfect compliment to swing back to that interview with John Paul, when you said, I knew at that moment, and I'm looking him in the eye, and we're having this conversation. And when you're talking politics or religion, and you're just putting something out there without any room for conversation, you're not going to change any minds.
Yeah.
And so I really respect that is kind of a guideline that you're using in your production company, because you can't make a positive difference by doing a one-sided announcement.
Yeah,
That's
it doesn't
kind of
help.
what I would see it as.
Right. And most of the heroes we prep with that statement. If you are going to get into this, realize you're going to lose half of your audience, and that may be the half that you need to connect with. So
exactly.
We don't do that in the content,
That makes sense, because you want to talk about that. You want to make it an engagement, an opportunity for conversation and discussion, rather than one-sided announcement of your feelings. And I really admire and respect that, especially given Matt in particular, your background. That's great. So any other stories you want to share before we close out this podcast? I'm waiting for one from Jason.
Yeah, he's got good ones too.
I want to hear something from your childhood, something that made you realize that being behind a camera helped you see things differently. I'm guessing that you have like a major pivotal time or an event that happened. I mean, I just think about that recording of John Paul and seeing it as an editor. That alone clearly indicated to you that what you were seeing live and in the present moment wasn't nearly what you would see later on.
Yeah. And we had to cut so much gold from that. Like, he's a motivational speaker professionally, so we had to cut so much down to get it to under 2 minutes. But video is the most powerful medium. And looking back, if there was a way I could make the biggest ding in the universe, it was going to be through video or short films. That's the way you could touch the most people. Going back to childhood, I remember going down south with my mom who's white. My dad was black. So I'm mixed. I'm 50-50. And I must have been about 8 or 9 years old. My dad wasn't in the picture. And my mom turned to me and said, son, we're going to go into this diner. And this was down south, 20, 30 years ago. We're going to go into this diner. And people may treat you a little bit differently here. But no matter what they say, you're my son. Like my flesh and blood. I birthed you. You're my son.
And I love you. Right. I'm here. Right. I got your back.
And I didn't understand. And that was like kind of like my first hint or hue of people aren't all equal in each other's eyes. What can we do about stuff like that? What can we do to bring people closer together, to break the barriers of not only politics and religion, but race as well? I could go out there and I could feed 100 homeless people. I could go out there and do something with like John Paul's doing with kids, but that's not my expertise. My expertise is telling stories visually. So why don't I find one of the 60 plus organizations or people, individuals that's already doing a really good job at that and tell their story in such a way that it affects more people than they ever could, or more people than I could ever affect individually. So that's kind of how we settled on it. Like this is the way to make the biggest impact in the world, aside from becoming like a political figurehead, which again, you have to.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
Jason, I want to go back to the diner.
Mm-hmm.
So you walked into the diner. What happened? Did it happen the way that she was predicting?
It was, I don't remember. It was like all white after that. Like nothing stuck out to me as, okay, there are racist people here, but just her statement alone was enough to get me thinking. And no one called me any names. Of course, I've been called racial slurs and names throughout my life, but no one at that moment did. So no.
Wow. So think about the impact here. She gives you this little warning. By the way, this might happen when we go inside. And it completely changed the way you look at the world.
Yeah.
So if she hadn't said anything and you walked in and nobody said anything, that moment wouldn't have happened. And who knows what would have been your wake-up call, that things are different. But isn't that fascinating though? Like she's trying to protect you.
Yeah.
It was absolutely her intention to prepare you in case something happened. And so she's thinking, the best thing I can do for my son at this moment is to give him a little heads up about something that might happen. But actually, I mean, if you look back and you had a video recorder of it, that's what changed you. It wasn't some response by somebody inside the diner.
Yeah.
And all that comes back to is that what we say and when we say it matters.
Yes.
And her intentions were absolutely in the right place.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. That's when you think about that moment and how it changed you totally unintentionally. One of the words I use all the time with my coaching clients and across the board is the word intention, of being intentional. And that was such an unintentional consequence.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And it's because it came from your mother, somebody that you loved and trusted so much.
Right. Yeah.
That could be a film all by itself.
Yeah. I didn't understand. She's not always known for her words, or choosing them. Sorry, Mom. I'm not going to send you the podcast. But, that absolutely she was trying to help because she was anticipating something and didn't want me sitting there blindsided, or it would have happened later on in life. I would have been blindsided either way, but just looking back to defining moments, that was one of them for sure.
Wow.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool because it probably softened what would have happened later on in life. If she hadn't given you that little delicate warning, then when it happened big time without her, it would have hurt even more. It would have been a deeper blow.
Yeah.
So that's kind of beautiful. I mean, wow.
Yeah.
I like your mom already. I think we'd get along just fine.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, guys, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about your stories and why you do what you do. I'm always fascinated, and I feel like the luckiest person on the planet to be able to have these conversations and just take the time and be totally present in this moment and listening to these stories and then sharing others. So thank you so much. Just for our listeners, I will have, along with this, I'll have a blog post that will have links to their company, links to both of their LinkedIn profiles. So feel free to get in touch with them and connect with these guys, Jason and Matt. And again, just thank you. That was an outstanding period of time to get to sit here and visit with you guys.
Well, cheese and crackers, Sarah. I did not expect to be bearing my soul here on the podcast. I don't think you did.
I was talking to her about video. Delve into the depths of life, and I'm tired, Sarah. It's been a long day.
I know. See, I got you when you were already tired. I knew your thought process might be a little compromised. So thanks again, guys.
Cool. Awesome being here.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me